So let's recap. I had a set of constraints. The game had to be played while hiking. It had to be played in sessions that lasted less than an hour. It had to be simple, but it also had to be crunchy. I had some goals. I needed to convey the feeling of wonder through exploration, and I really wanted to display rapid consequences in a meaningful and impactful way. So once again, I really needed my wife's buy-in on the theme. And a big part of that is the setting, which meant if we're catering to her tastes, that breadth of worlds I can dip into gets narrowed down to her tastes. Now, once again, constraints aren't a bad thing. They're what allow creativity to really thrive. So almost immediately, I knew this had to be some sort of fantasy. My wife loves fantasy, especially lower-powered fantasy, and dragons. So the idea of a wanderlust-filled fantasy game seemed really enthralling to me. I immediately had this image in my head that kind of became the poster for the game in my mind. It's, this image of a Boy Scouts-esque character with this huge, oversized backpack with like little scrolls and bits and bobs hanging off the ends, like a compass and a flask and all sorts of stuff. With this red cap with a feather coming out of it and a long red flowing cape in a heroic pose, his back to the camera, standing in between narrow canyon walls with an amber sunset fading over the horizon with rolling hills as far as the eye can see, filled with wonder and possibility. And this internal image ended up being the guiding light of the theme for me, really up until this day. But that's all just setting, which isn't the major part of theming. In my opinion, theming has to be portrayed in everything, right down to the very components that you use in your game. And I had lofty goals, and I made a really honest start on fulfilling them. Honestly, I really did. So for the rest of this episode, we're going to talk about how I tried to accomplish those things, but then also how I kind of lost focus on the goal for a little bit, and where that happened, and why and how. So I started in on the broad strokes of the design for the game. The rules would have to properly convey the theme, or else it would be theme in name and setting only. I kind of feel that Numenera fell prey to this trap, while a game like A Single Moment displays the power that can imbue a game with, when the theming is so baked into the rules that every single decision that the players make constantly reinforces this theme of Bushido, of honor, of making choices to further your clan's honor, further the honor of your name, but then also this growing feud between two samurais that will inevitably end in the death of one of them in a final showdown. It is brilliant. If you've never played it, I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic system that generates beautiful stories. And we played that for a few hours one Sunday afternoon. And I will never forget the experiences my wife and I had playing that game. We only played it once, but it's going to stick with me forever. Meanwhile, I had a Numenera campaign run for nearly a year. And I've forgotten probably about 95% of what that game campaign was. Now, there's a lot of factors that come into play there, but I really do feel one of the big things there is the rules had the theme baked in. So, considering my constraints of simplicity versus complexity, it was apparent that there would need to be two different user types, which worked very well for player and DM. My wife, the player, would be playing in kind of a more rules-light system. There wouldn't be any crunchy math. None of this like, okay, if it's a D20, then every number is like 5%. Now I have to like figure out the best way to accomplish. No, it's just kind of, I do the thing, I roll to do the thing, I accomplish or fail at the thing. Meanwhile, the DM, my side, would have much more complicated world building in between the sessions. That's that creative juice that I love about role-playing games. We'd have some imaginary rule sets to help determine how things evolve over time and how we can provide a good experience for the player in the next session. And to the point of that, for the next session, ties into how I was going to try and accomplish the other goal of the game, which is the wonder of exploration. So I decided that the DM would create a map of a zone with about 6 areas inside of that zone. These would be things that the player would choose. Okay, I want to go to the Mushroom Swamp this game session. And they would go there, and they would interact with it, and they would learn about it, and they would explore it, and they would try and ideally find some way to interact with that area to bring some beneficial effect back to civilization, quote unquote, right? To their homeland. And that was the idea. They would go from location to location, kind of tipping the scales of each area one way or the other. Hopefully, once again, bringing back positive benefits to their home base. Now, this had a lot of really interesting benefits because that meant every single session could be a tightly contained individual story, thereby satisfying the need of my wife for kind of fast story, happen in less than an hour, but then also allow for an overarching, evolving set of circumstances and plot that satisfy my itch. Additionally, in between sessions, let's say someone went to the Kobold encampment and decided, you know what, I hate these little dragon worshippers, I'm just gonna kill them all. Well, that's gonna have consequences. So the DM, in between sessions, would say, all right, so like, these areas all have different ties and connections to each other. How do those get impacted by the fact that the kobolds are gone? Well, let's see. The human encampment nearby, the new settlement that just popped up, that's going to start growing a lot more unchecked, a lot more uncontrolled, which means they would start consuming more natural resources, which means that mushroom swamp we talked about earlier, maybe that becomes completely deforested, and that would drive out wildlife. And that would spread them into other areas, and they would have effects incurring on the areas that they flee to, and so on and so forth. And that way the DM can then build out this world, manage circumstances, manage fronts. You know, the brilliant guys who made Dungeon World talk a lot about fronts in a way that really satisfies that world-building, complicated gaming itch for me. And that's kind of where my theming stopped for a really long time. I felt like I had matched the theme. I felt like I had met my goals of conveying the feeling of wonder through exploration. I felt like I had displayed rapid consequences through meaningful and impactful ways. I had met my constraints of being able to be played while hiking, you know, theoretically, and being played in less than an hour, simple, scratching gaming itch, etc. And so I kind of left everything by the wayside. But the real problem was I didn't recognize that I had done that. So I kept on coming up with other rules. I started moving on like character creation and what sort of system we'd be using for our random number generation. But my consideration of theme was not in those systems. And that ended up causing a lot of problems and forced me to come back to things a lot later on. So before I get this episode to be too long, let me end it here. Let's talk about the other systems that I developed next episode. And I'll go in over time, kind of the effect that had on initial playtests that I had. And how I eventually had to return to those and retool most of the game in order to fit the theme more appropriately. Thanks for watching. See you next week.